The war had long passed the point of desperation. From the bridge of the command ship Vesher's Resolve, High Commander Kale Vurick stared at the holographic map that painted the galaxy in streaks of red and blue. The red, enemy territory, spread like a consuming fire. Only scattered patches of blue remained, isolated islands in an ocean of conquest. Kale's scaled hands trembled as he leaned against the console. It wasn't fear, not anymore. Fear had burned away months ago, leaving only exhaustion. The Keltar Dominion's latest assault had shattered 3 more strongholds, and their unyielding fleets would soon descend upon the core worlds. Their enemy was relentless, its soldiers bred for war, their machines imbued with deadly precision. The Dominion didn't negotiate, didn't hesitate. It simply consumed. "Commander," a voice broke through his reverie. Kale turned to see Advisor Lorana, her iridescent fins drooping, a sign of her species' shared despair. "The Council has convened. They require your presence immediately." Kale nodded, though he wanted nothing more than to retreat into solitude. The Council chambers, situated deep within the ship, were filled with representatives of the Allied systems. A dozen species sat around the circular table, their faces etched with defeat. There were the hulking Bernari, their 4 arms crossed in frustration, the fragile Yulan, their translucent bodies faintly pulsing with light, and the serpentine Tresic, whose normally vibrant patterns had dulled to muted tones. Unity among them had always been fragile, but now it was fraying entirely. "We have no options left," boomed General Hreric of the Bernari, his voice shaking the chamber walls. "The Dominion advances without pause. Our fleets are scattered, our resources dwindling. Even if we consolidate, we cannot match their strength. We must sue for peace," Lorana said, her voice trembling. "If we surrender, they may spare our core systems." "Surrender," spat the Tresic diplomat, narrowing her slitted eyes. "You think the Dominion spares anyone? They do not conquer to coexist. They conquer to exterminate." Kale let the argument wash over him, the same tired cycle repeating. For months, they debated strategies, proposed alliances, and entertained impossible gambits, all to no avail. But today, there was a new proposition on the table, one that sent a shiver of unease through the room. "We have one remaining possibility," said Lorana, her voice hesitant. "We could call upon them." Silence fell. The unspoken name lingered like a specter. Even the stoic Bernari shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew who she meant. "Humans?" The word came from Hreric, thick with incredulity. "You would have us summon the most volatile, barbaric species in the galaxy? The ones who turned their own homeworld into a battlefield for centuries before retreating into isolation? That's madness." "It is also our last chance," Lorana countered. "We all know the stories. Humans may be barbaric, but they are survivors. They do not fight wars as we do. They fight to win, no matter the cost." Kale raised a hand, silencing the growing murmurs. "If we summon them," he said, his voice deliberate, "there is no guarantee they will answer. Humanity has kept itself hidden for nearly 2 centuries. They do not involve themselves in galactic affairs. Why would they come to our aid now?" "They may not," Lorana admitted, "but they will hear us. And if they choose to answer, we might finally have a force capable of turning the tide." Kale studied the faces around the table. Fear mingled with reluctant hope. The idea of inviting humanity back into the fold was as terrifying as it was tantalizing. Few in the galaxy had ever encountered a human, but the legends were enough to inspire both awe and dread. They were said to be relentless warriors, their military strategies bordering on insanity, but yielding impossible victories. Some claimed they had weapons so destructive that even the Dominion would think twice before challenging them. "I will not stake our survival on myths," Hreric said, slamming a fist on the table. "We need a tangible plan, not fairy tales of a savage race." "And what plan would you suggest?" Lorana shot back. "Another retreat? Another desperate attempt to hold a crumbling line? The humans are our only hope, however slim it may be." Kale closed his eyes, the weight of command pressing down on him. He had spent his life defending the Allied systems, had made decisions that cost millions their lives, all in the name of survival. Now he stood on the brink of what could be his final gamble. He opened his eyes and spoke. "Send the message." The council erupted into chaos, voices clashing in a cacophony of protest and reluctant agreement. But Kale had made his decision. If humanity lived up to even a fraction of its legend, they might stand a chance. If not, they were doomed regardless. Hours later, Kale stood alone in the communications chamber, watching as the encoded signal was transmitted into the void. It was a simple message addressed to the last known coordinates of the human colony worlds. "We are dying. We need your help, asterisk asterisk." The silence that followed was deafening. Kale wasn't sure what he expected. A reply, an acknowledgement, perhaps nothing at all. He only knew that they had thrown the last of their hope into the darkness, waiting for an answer that might never come. As days turned into weeks, the Dominion's advance continued unabated. Kale fought to keep morale afloat, to rally his forces even as defeat loomed closer. He began to wonder if humanity had truly vanished, if their legends were nothing more than a desperate galaxy clinging to a myth. Then, one fateful day, a ship appeared. It tore through Dominion patrols like a predator among prey, its dark, angular hull bristling with weaponry unlike anything the Allied systems had ever seen. From its sleek form emerged a signal, a single, chilling transmission that sent shivers through every member of the Council. "Message received. Stand by." Kale's breath caught as he stared at the display. The humans had answered. For better or worse, the galaxy's most feared warriors had returned. And now, the war would change forever. The human fleet arrived like an impending storm, its ships emerging from hyperspace with precision that bordered on predatory instinct. Their vessels were unlike anything the Allied systems had ever seen, sleek, angular, and painted in a matte black that seemed to absorb the light around them. Their engines emitted a low, ominous hum, and their formations were tight, deliberate, as if every movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Kale Vurick stood on the bridge of the Veshura's Resolve, watching in a mix of awe and unease as the human flagship loomed into view, dwarfing his own vessel. The humans' arrival had silenced even the most vocal dissenters among the Council. The mere sight of their fleet spoke volumes. These were not allies arriving to offer cautious assistance. These were predators joining the hunt. Kale's scaled fingers flexed as he stared at the comms officer, waiting for the first words from the enigmatic species that had chosen to answer their plea. When the transmission came through, the voice was calm, devoid of the fear or hesitation Kale had grown accustomed to among his allies. "This is Commander Elena Graves of the Terran Vanguard," the human said, her tone clipped and efficient. "We've reviewed your situation. Directive Alpha 4 has been authorized. Provide us with access to your tactical data and prepare to integrate your forces under our command." The words hit like a hammer. Kale exchanged glances with Lorana, who stood beside him, her fins stiff with apprehension. Integration under human command? It was a demand, not a request, and one that threatened to ignite the fragile egos of the Council. Yet Kale knew better than to argue. The humans hadn't come this far to negotiate. Kale stepped forward, his voice steady. "We acknowledge your authority, Commander Graves. The Allied systems are at your disposal." The transmission ended without ceremony. The humans, it seemed, had no patience for pleasantries. Within hours, their fleet had deployed reconnaissance drones that mapped enemy positions with uncanny speed. Their soldiers, armored in dark, lightweight exosuits, moved through the corridors of the Veshura's Resolve like ghosts, speaking in low tones and exuding an air of absolute confidence. Kale watched them with a mix of admiration and trepidation. These were not warriors fighting to survive. They were specialists, trained for one purpose: victory. The first joint operation came days later. Dominion forces had entrenched themselves on Greela's Prime, a strategic world whose loss had severed key supply lines. Recapturing it had seemed impossible, until the humans arrived. Commander Graves herself led the operation, her presence a stark contrast to the larger-than-life image many had expected. She was a woman of medium stature, her features sharp and unyielding, her dark eyes scanning every detail as if committing it to memory. She spoke little, issuing commands with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. Kale observed the battle from the command center, his nerves taut as he watched the operation unfold. The humans' tactics were unlike anything the Allied systems had ever attempted. Their soldiers used the terrain with surgical precision, exploiting weaknesses in the Dominion's defenses with an almost predatory cunning. They didn't rely on brute force or overwhelming numbers. They relied on speed, misdirection, and unrelenting aggression. One moment stood out, seared into Kale's memory. A Dominion stronghold had been identified as the linchpin of their defense, heavily fortified and thought to be impenetrable. Instead of a frontal assault, the humans deployed a diversionary force to draw attention away from the primary objective. At the same time, a small unit infiltrated the stronghold, disabling its defenses from within before delivering a payload that obliterated the structure in a single, devastating strike. It was ruthless. It was effective. As the Dominion forces crumbled, Kale felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced in months. The humans had not only reclaimed Gorilla's Prime, they had done so with minimal losses. Yet the cost of their methods was evident. Civilians caught in the crossfire were collateral damage, their fates a secondary concern to the humans' singular focus on victory. Kale's stomach churned as he reviewed the reports. Was this the price of survival? Later, as he stood in the observation deck, watching the ruins of Gorilla's Prime from orbit, Commander Graves joined him. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the planet below. When she finally spoke, her words were measured. "You disapprove," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Kale hesitated. "I struggle with the cost," he admitted. "We fight to protect our people. But at what point do we lose the very thing we're trying to save?" Graves turned to him, her expression unreadable. "War isn't about preservation, High Commander. It's about ending the threat. The longer you draw it out, the more you lose lives, resources, hope. We do what must be done so that others don't have to." Her words were chilling in their pragmatism, but Kale couldn't deny their truth. The Allied systems had spent months fighting a defensive war, clinging to ideals while the Dominion advanced unchecked. The humans didn't cling to ideals. They clung to results. Over the next weeks, the Dominion's momentum faltered. The humans brought not only new weapons and tactics, but also a discipline that began to bleed into the Allied forces. Under their guidance, once disparate species learned to fight as a single unit, their differences set aside in the face of shared necessity. Victory after victory followed, each one hard-fought and decisive. Yet with every battle, Kale noticed the same pattern. The humans never hesitated, never faltered, no matter the moral weight of their actions. The turning point came during the assault on Krythos Station, a Dominion hub that served as a critical supply route. The station was heavily populated, not only with Dominion forces, but with enslaved workers from subjugated worlds. The humans devised a plan that would cripple the Dominion supply lines, but the cost was staggering. The destruction of the station and everyone aboard. Kale stood before the council, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Arguments erupted around him, voices raised in protest and resignation. Lorena looked to him, her fins trembling. "You must decide, High Commander. Do we sanction this?" Kale's gaze shifted to Graves, who stood silently in the corner, her expression as unyielding as ever. She offered no argument, no justification. She simply waited. He took a breath, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. "Do it." The operation was a success. Krythos Station was reduced to debris, its destruction dealing a crippling blow to the Dominion. But as Kale stood in the aftermath, watching the shattered remnants of the station drift through space, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed an invisible line. Commander Graves approached him, her voice low. "This is how we win, High Commander." Kale didn't respond. He could only hope that she was right. The Dominion's final bastion loomed ahead, a massive fortress orbiting the dead world of Ashar. Its defenses were formidable, its position impenetrable by conventional means. To the Allied systems, it had long been a symbol of inevitability, a place no fleet could breach, no army could conquer. But as Kale Vurick stood on the bridge of the Veshera's Resolve, flanked by Commander Elena Graves, he no longer saw it as an insurmountable obstacle. He saw it as an end. The human fleet had assembled in tight, disciplined formation, their dark ships stark against the void. The combined forces of the Allied systems hovered nearby, their numbers bolstered, but their morale tempered by weeks of relentless warfare. Even now, whispers of unease rippled through the ranks. The humans' ruthlessness had brought them to this moment, but at a cost that many still struggled to accept. The destruction of Krythos Station weighed heavily on them all, and Kale knew the memory would haunt him long after this war was over, if he survived to see its end. Graves stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the holographic display of the Dominion fortress. "The stronghold is powered by a central fusion core," she said, her voice as sharp and precise as the weapon she commanded. "Take out the core, and the entire station will collapse. Our job is to get a strike team inside. The rest of the fleet will draw fire and hold the Dominion at bay." Her calmness was infuriating, yet it steadied Kale in a way he couldn't quite explain. He nodded. "And the casualties?" She didn't flinch. Acceptable. That word. It hung in the air like a blade, slicing through any illusion of compromise. Kale turned to his officers, who awaited his orders. The tension in the room was palpable, but he knew hesitation would only breed chaos. "Relay the plan to all ships," he said. "We begin the assault in 1 hour." The attack began with a coordinated barrage from the Allied fleet, a dazzling array of plasma fire and missile salvos aimed at the fortress's outer defenses. The Dominion responded in kind, their weapons ripping through the void with brutal precision. Ships exploded in flashes of light, their debris scattering like splinters of shattered hope. Kale watched the carnage unfold, his hands gripping the console as if he could will the losses to stop. Amid the chaos, the humans moved with terrifying efficiency. Their fleet carved through the Dominion's lines, their ships maneuvering with an almost predatory grace. Strike teams launched from their carriers, cutting through enemy defenses like blades through cloth. Graves was among them, leading the infiltration force tasked with reaching the fusion core. Kale had offered to join her, but she had refused. "Your place is here," she had said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the minutes dragged on, Kale could only monitor their progress through fragmented reports and flickering visuals. The strike team faced heavy resistance, each step forward paid for in blood. Dominion forces swarmed the corridors, their relentless advance threatening to overwhelm even the humans' formidable tactics. Yet Graves pushed on, her voice steady over the comms as she coordinated the assault. "We're close," she said, her breathing labored but controlled. "Hold the line." The words became a mantra, repeated by every Allied soldier as they fought to keep the Dominion fleet at bay. Ships collided in fiery bursts, their sacrifices buying precious seconds for the infiltration team. Kale's heart pounded as he watched the casualty count climb. For every Dominion ship destroyed, 2 Allied vessels fell. He knew this battle couldn't last much longer. Then a message came through. "Core is in sight," Graves said, her voice crackling with interference. "Setting charges now." Kale exhaled, his relief tempered by the knowledge of what was to come. The destruction of the core would trigger a chain reaction, obliterating the fortress and everyone still inside. Graves and her team had known the risks from the beginning. They had chosen to proceed anyway. "Graves," Kale said, his voice unsteady. "You need to get out of there." There was a pause, filled only by the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. When she spoke again, her tone was resolute. "Negative, High Commander. There's no time for an extraction. This is how we win." Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing for alternatives. But there were none. Graves had made her choice, and he couldn't undo it. The line went silent, and he knew it was the last time he would hear her voice. Moments later, a blinding light consumed the fortress. The explosion rippled outward, tearing through the Dominion fleet with a force that shook the Allied ships even from a distance. Kale shielded his eyes, his breath caught in his throat as he watched the stronghold disintegrate into a field of debris. The Dominion forces faltered, their coordination unraveling in the wake of the fortress's destruction. For the first time, the enemy seemed vulnerable. A cheer erupted across the Allied fleet, a sound of triumph that echoed through the comms. Cale didn't join in. His gaze remained fixed on the remnants of the fortress, his thoughts heavy with the cost of their victory. Graves had been right. This was how they won. But it was also how they lost a part of themselves. Hours later, as the fleet regrouped and began its retreat, Cale found himself alone in the observation deck. The stars outside seemed dimmer, their light muted by the weight of what had transpired. Lorana joined him, her fins drooping in quiet mourning. "We did it," she said softly. "The Dominion is broken." Cale nodded, though the words offered little comfort. "At what price?" he murmured. Lorana didn't answer. There was no answer that could satisfy the question, no way to measure the value of lives lost against the hope of survival. They had won the war, but the scars it left would linger for generations. As Cale stared into the void, he thought of Graves and the humans who had fought beside her. They had brought them to this moment, had given them the means to survive. But they had also reminded them of a truth that could never be forgotten. Victory was never without cost. And as the fleet drifted into the unknown, Cale could only wonder what kind of future they had secured, and whether it was worth the price they had paid.